Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for logging in. I'm super excited to spend a little bit of time with all of you here this afternoon. Really excited to get to play my small part in Summer Series, and just thank you for calling in, and thank you for, I'm sure you've already been in a bunch of really entertaining sessions, so I will try and live up to the expectation and live up to the high quality of what you've seen so far. I'm going to go ahead and make sure. Hopefully you can now see my screen and you can see the slides. My name is Graham West. I'm the Media and Communications Director here at the Sikh Coalition. And today I'm really excited to talk to all of you about how to write and pitch an op-ed piece. So an opinion article that would appear in your local newspaper or on an online website. So with that, I'd always like at the beginning of any presentation to sort of lay out what I'm going to walk folks through and what we're going to talk about. And I do want this to, be a conversation. If you have questions at any point, if you put them in the little chat window, Sajit will, pass them along to me, and I can answer those. But I kind of want to focus on, these 5 things throughout the presentation. We're going to talk about what is and what is not an op-ed piece. We're going to ask, why do we write op-eds? Like, why is it important to know how to do this? What do you need for writing an op-ed? How do you actually do it? And then how do you go about pitching it to your local newspaper? That's pretty much going to be it. And hopefully we'll cover a lot of ground here in an hour, and then have plenty of time for questions afterwards. So just a little bit to, about me. Like I said, my name is Graham. I'm the Media and Communications Director here at the Sikh Coalition. I actually, as of today, have been in this position for 1 year. So a year ago today, I came to the Sikh position, to the Sikh Coalition. And before that, I spent a good amount of time, 5 years total, 3 years as the Director of Communications for another organization that focused on advocacy on issues of national security. But really, even before that, I mean, my very first job, my very first stint in communications, what got me into my field was a job writing and pitching op-ed pieces. This is sort of like my bread and butter, I guess you would say, my original work that I was doing in the communications field. I also wrote a syndicated column for about 1.5 years. So I like to think that I've got a pretty good sense of, how to write for a popular audience, and how to talk about writing in newspapers. Just to give you a sense, I mean, I put a couple of headlines up there of different pieces that I've worked on, things that I've done. Some of them you can tell are definitely when I was working for the Sikh Coalition. Some of them are, before, when I was working on all sorts of stuff from climate change to foreign policy and everything in between. But I'm really excited to, share my experience with all of you, and hopefully inspire you to do some op-ed writing of your own in the future. So let's get right to it, right? Sort of the first most basic question, what is an op-ed? What are we talking about when we say op-ed? A lot of folks assume that the word op-ed means opinion editorial, and that's pretty close to the truth. It actually means opposite the editorial page. So in any newspaper, right, one of my favorites, the Washington Post, you have one side of the page in the print newspaper that has the editorials. Those are the views of the people who work for the newspaper. They sit down and write about current events. And then opposite that, on the other side of the page, you have the op-eds, which are the views of the people who read the paper. So anytime you see something in a newspaper that's an op-ed, it's not being written by somebody who works at the paper. I used to get emails from people when I wrote my column, and they'd say, "Oh, you're such a biased journalist. Like, I can't believe that you're putting your opinion in the newspaper." And it's like, I'm not a reporter. I'm not a journalist. I'm a person just like you who's writing a piece for the newspaper, and you can write one too. So that's what an op-ed is. It always, and this is kind of my main thing for this presentation, so I'm sorry you're going to hear me say it a lot, an op-ed always presents an opinion, right? There's one opinion, one sentence that you want your reader to walk away with and to keep in mind for the rest of the day. That's what an op-ed is. It's written by somebody like you or me, right, who doesn't work for a newspaper. And it usually falls within a word limit, like a specific number of words. You can't just write 1,000, 2,000 words in an op-ed. There's usually an upper limit of less than 500 words, less than 700 words. The reason for that is just because op-eds take up room in newspapers, right? Like, you have to, the editor has to think about how many different opinions they can fit onto the page. So for a small local paper, like your hometown paper, that's usually going to have a lower limit, like 550 words. Whereas, you know, a bigger newspaper with more editors and more capacity, they might let you write, you know, 850 words instead. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but it's very important to know when you start writing an op-ed what the rules are, how many words you can use, and those types of things. So definitely, you know, I think it's easy or important when you're trying to figure out how to do something. You say, okay, what is an op-ed? Well, what isn't an op-ed, right? What is something that it does not count as an op-ed? And I think sometimes that's just as useful to know. So, you know, very short pieces, I'm talking like 200 words, like little reactions to things that you saw in the newspaper and you thought, hey, I've got, you know, an opinion about that. I want to say something about that. That's what's called a letter to the editor. Letters to the editors are similar to op-eds. They're just usually a lot shorter, and they're usually in response specifically to something in the paper. And if folks have questions about letters to the editor, I've written a few of those in my day as well, so I'm happy to talk about that too. Summaries of events that happened. So, you know, if something happened and you want to just write like this thing happened, there's no opinion, there's no idea there. That's reporting. So newspapers employ people, reporters who go out and cover events. So if you wanted, say, to write an op-ed about an open house that your Gurdwara hosted, that's okay as long as you have an opinion, right? Maybe the opinion is you should come visit us on Sunday for services. Or maybe the opinion is we need more Sikh awareness in our community. But if you're just saying like this event happened and you're not offering any sort of opinion or anything, then that is, that's just straight up reporting. Promotional material, this is a big one. Promotional material for your company, for your Gurdwara, for a book you're working on, for anything other than an opinion, that's advertising, right? So papers charge money for you to put an advertisement that says, you know, come buy this product or read this book or do this thing. So if you want to do advertising, that's definitely a different conversation than writing an op-ed. And then last but not least, that's super important, anything that's over, you know, 1,000, 1,500 words, that's just too long, right? That's not an op-ed at that point. It's just your opinion. And maybe you could publish it, you know, on your own blog online, on your own website. But most papers are going to say, hey, you know, less than 600 words, less than 700, 800 words tops. It just kind of depends on the paper. So hopefully that's helpful to get a sense for like what is and what is not an op-ed. Does anybody have any questions? I just kind of want to stop at each of these sections and make sure that everybody can, that everybody's following along if you have any questions.
And for those that do have questions, either use the chat function or you can raise your hands and I can unmute you at that point.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Christine. Oh, I think maybe there's a hand raised.
Yeah, it's my hand. Are op-eds only for like newspapers, or can they be for like digital blogs or like digital newspapers?
Yeah, great question. Definitely for digital publications as well. If you hear me say newspaper throughout this presentation, it's interchangeable. Just anywhere that accepts outside opinion pieces definitely counts. So yeah, great question. I think in my experience, digital outlets, you know, online magazines, whatever, they usually have higher word counts, so you can write a little bit more because there's no physical constraint about how many words can be put onto the page. But yeah, great question. Okie dokie. Then I will go ahead and move on here to, you know, why do we write op-eds? Three reasons I think that come to mind for me. The first one is what I call moving the needle, right? We have this opinion that we care about. We want other people to act on it. And so we write an op-ed piece specifically designed to change minds, to get people to do things. We do a lot of this at the Sikh Coalition in the context of laws and legislation, right? So both of these pieces that are up on the screen right now, we have the top one was a federal level law, a national law about hate crime prevention, written by a member of our policy team. The piece underneath it there for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, this was a piece written by a Sikh community member. His state, Pennsylvania, was considering to passing new hate crime laws. And so he wrote a piece in the biggest paper in the state saying, hey, I think this is, you know, a good idea and we should pass these. pass these laws for these reasons, right? Moving the needle writing an op-ed is a great way to move the needle and convince people, specifically because our lawmakers do pay attention to online outlets, right? In the same way that they pay attention to if you call their office and ask them to do something or vote for something or vote against something. It's just another way of changing hearts and minds in that way. The second reason, right, that we write an op-ed is to demonstrate our expertise. Sometimes you see something happening in the news, you have an opinion, and it's something that you know a little bit about yourself, right? Maybe just from your personal experience that you've lived, or maybe, you know, your career expertise. Both of these pieces that are up here on the screen now are definitely are certainly related to the professional expertise of the people who wrote them. The NJ.com one that was written by Sajit about a year ago, all about the importance of, you know, recognizing hate and stopping hate crimes and better laws. She wrote that as the director of a civil rights organization, right? That's her expertise. Underneath that, Captain Simmer Singh, who's a soldier in the US Army, he wrote a piece about why it's important for Sikhs to be able to maintain their articles of faith when they serve in the military, if they choose to do so, right? So in that case, like, he's writing from his own professional experience. He went through you know, a lawsuit and advocacy campaign to allow him to do that. And so, you know, writing an op-ed is a really good way, you know, if you're not a pundit, if you're not somebody who just gets to sit on the news and talk about your opinions, writing an op-ed is a great way for an everyday citizen to say, hey, I know a little bit about this issue and why it's important. And then the last thing that the last reason that we write an op-ed, I think, is, you know, this idea of sharing our story, getting your personal voice out there and connecting with your audience through telling them a story, through demonstrating your values, things that you think are important, things that they think are important. And I have two examples for this, and I actually want to, give me just 1 second. I want to read you tiny excerpts from both of these pieces because they're both important. The top one was a really positive op-ed. It was written by a gentleman out in Stockton, California, all about the Save a project that his community has been doing in light of the pandemic, right? And he used this as an opportunity to argue for greater Sikh awareness in his community. He wrote, Sikh Americans and Sikh Californians don't need special recognition for being a part of the communities that we love. We do, however, need equal treatment, visibility, and respect. So that's like a good way, right? He's sharing his own personal experience to make an argument for greater Sikh awareness in his community. The piece underneath it is a lot more depressing, frankly. It was written by our legal director, Amrit Kaur, and she writes about kind of her very first experience with, you know, the almost casual racism of, like, go back to your country. She wrote, you know, in kindergarten, I remember the excitement of my first Daisy Scouts meeting, arriving with my turban-wearing grandfather in tow. My excitement quickly dissipated, however, as my fellow 5-year-olds isolated me, questioning why I was there and why I didn't go back to where I came from because I didn't belong. That's a tough story to hear, right? It's a tough story to read, but in sharing that, right, Amrit was demonstrating why phrases like go back to your country are really hurtful. And so it's a way of almost connecting with your audience by saying, like, hey, this is something that happened to me personally. This is why I hold this opinion, and I hope you listen, and I hope you care about it. The trick of this, right, is that the best op-eds do all of these things at the same time, right? If you can, you know, move the needle on an issue and demonstrate that you know something about that issue and share a personal story to drive it home, that's kind of like the sweet spot there in the middle of the diagram in terms of making a convincing opinion piece. I think a really good example of this was a piece that we put in The Hill several months ago by a member of our legal team named Assis Kaur. She talked a lot about her family's experience with bullying in schools. Her brother experienced some really nasty, severe bullying when he was just a kid in middle school. And she sort of comes at this from, like, telling her family story for sure, being an expert in the sense that, like, you know, she lived through this experience and now works on legal cases, including school bullying. And she did it all to move the needle, right? To talk to the members of Congress who read The Hill and say, hey, we really need to pass, you know, these laws that will make it better for kids to go to school and not have to be picked on because of who they are. So if you can kind of land in the middle of all three of those things, I think that that's definitely the best place to be when you're writing an op-ed. That's a big part of why we do this at the Sikh Coalition, right? Like we set out to raise the Sikh profile across all of our programmatic work, whether it's the stuff that we do for education or empowering the community, or legal work or employment discrimination. All of that stuff is about making sure that Sikh Americans get to participate in the conversation. Op-eds are just one way that we do that, right? Sometimes we pitch stories like we did with this outstanding United Shades episode on CNN. Sometimes we, encourage reporters to come out to events at gurdwaras or take coverage of employment discrimination victories, hate crimes, whatever the case may be. But all of this is geared around making sure that, at any given moment in America, a lot of people are talking, a lot of people are sharing their opinions. And if we can't carve out a space for the Sikh community to do that too, then other people are going to fill that space right up. And so, that's kind of my approach. And when I sit down to, whether it's to write an op-ed with a member of our staff or to work directly with a community member and get their voice out there, it's like, I want to help make sure that, the community is able to participate in that conversation. And op-eds are just one more tool to get that done. So I think I want to pause then again before we dive into kind of the bare bones pieces of what we need to write an op-ed, and just to see if anybody has any questions on that.
Harpreet, if you want to unmute yourself, I just sent you. You have to accept the request to unmute. If you want to chat your question instead. Okay, it's not for some reason. Harpreet, if you can chat your question, that'd be great. Oh, there you go.
Realize that. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Sorry, Harpreet, did you have a question?
No, I didn't. I'm so sorry.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay, good deal. Then I think I'll keep going then, and we'll stop for questions again in a minute. So what do we need to write an op-ed, right? What are the essential ingredients? I guess you might say 4 things as far as I'm concerned. An opinion, right? That thing that you're trying to get across to people. A news hook, which we'll talk about what that means in a second. Some research to back your opinion up. And then, an audience in mind, a group of people that you're really trying to speak to and connect with. The opinion is the easiest part, right? Everybody's got opinions. I got opinions on a bunch of different issues. I'm sure that you have a bunch of opinions too. It's very easy to come up with an opinion. It's a little bit harder to narrow it down and focus it to where you can use it in an op-ed. But what I would recommend is, before you sit down and start to write, you want to have one sentence that you want people to walk away with, right? One main idea that's going to stick in their head and motivate them to feel a different way or think a different way or do something that they weren't going to do before. So a couple of different examples, right? And these are taken, kind of more from the Sikh Coalition's work. So, Sikhism and other religious groups must be included in state social studies standards. That speaks to, the education work that we do across the country. In this time of COVID-19, we must step up to help our neighbors and reject racism. That's, I think, a really good opinion, but definitely something that you could turn into an op-ed. And then something even broader and more general: raising Sikh awareness will have positive results for Sikhs and non-Sikhs alike in our community. We've written many op-eds that's the main idea of. So from this point forward, when I talk about like your opinion or like your thesis statement, the main idea of your op-ed, this is what I'm referring to. This like this one sentence idea that you really want folks to walk away with. A news hook. So the news hook is what makes your opinion timely and relevant, right? And it's meant to like hook people in and get them into the conversation. Strong news hooks, there's a bunch of different things that you can use. News stories are obviously kind of the most helpful and easy ones, right? If a newspaper is publishing, reporting on something that happened, they're going to be likely to take some opinion pieces about that too, because then they kind of present to people, here's our reporting on the issue, and then here's what people in the community or people in our audience have to say about it. Anniversaries or holidays, I think, are really helpful for getting attention to talk about specific issues. So, as we all know, here in a couple weeks, the 8th anniversary of the Oak Creek shooting is coming up, which is, a very painful memory, but also I think a memory that we can honor by making sure that, you know, people know and remember the people who were hurt and the people who were killed in that attack, and why it's important to learn from that and to honor their legacies moving forward. So anniversaries are a good opportunity to get an opinion out there if your opinion relates to the thing that's coming up. Civic engagement opportunities, right? So elections, speeches, debates, political advertisements, anything that you want to comment on the, you know, the government and the way that things are going in our democracy. Those are always great news hooks, especially because reporters love talking about that kind of stuff. And so editors love to be able to publish opinion pieces about those kinds of things. And then last but not least, events in your community, right? Again, to return to the example of the Gurdwara open house, if you want somebody to just to come and report the facts of what happened, then that's where you invite a reporter. But if you want to write about the open house and why you think it's important and why you'd like people to join and come and see and sit with the community, then that sounds more like an op-ed piece. And you can use an event that's coming up or an event that just happened as a reason to write an op-ed too. So I wrote here two different news hooks, right? And I'm just going to read both of them out loud to you, and then we'll kind of look and see which one we think might be the more effective news hook. First one says, Sikhs are the third most targeted group in America when it comes to hate crimes and other bias incidents. It is past time for our city to create a hate crimes task force to protect everyone from bias motivated attacks. Okay. Second one says, earlier this week, a Sikh store owner in Colorado was attacked and told to go back to his country by the man who assaulted him. It's past time for our city to create a hate crimes task force to protect everyone from these kinds of bias motivated attacks. So both of these speak to the same opinion, right? The same main point. The main point is, let's get a task force to make sure that people don't suffer from hate crimes. But the two news hooks are different, right? The first one talks about a statistic, fact and figure. The second one talks about something that happened recently. And this is a case that happened a few months ago in April. So I'm stretching the truth here just a little bit. But so the second one, right? The one that begins with earlier this week, the one that talks about a really relevant and timely story, that's the better news hook. That's the better way to start your op-ed. That stat about Sikhs being the third most targeted group, that's a real figure that came from the FBI's hate crime report last week. That'd be a great thing to include in your op-ed, you know, later on down in the piece for sure, as a piece of evidence to support your idea for a hate crimes task force. But in terms of drawing people in terms of getting their attention and talking about a really timely thing that happened recently, the second one is definitely the way to go. The third thing you need is research, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we're going to dive into it a lot in the next section, but there are lots of ways to back up your main opinion, right? You can talk about, you know, facts and statistics, like the thing that I pulled from the FBI report. You can talk about quotes from different people called validators, people who your audience is going to believe and listen to. And you can talk about your own personal experience too. Like I said, share your story. It's all right to talk in the first person, to say I and me and we when you're talking in an op-ed and sharing about things that happened to you. So we'll circle back to these and talk about them a little bit more. So I'm going to kind of skip over them for right now. But I think one thing you might be able to notice here is like, hey, if I have an opinion that I want to share and I have lots of research to back it up, you can write most of your op-ed and then wait for that perfect news hook to come along, right? It's okay to write in advance and wait for a good opportunity to try and share your story. I think that that's something that can be really helpful rather than the time pressure of like, oh, this event happened on Monday and I need to hurry up and write my first op-ed by, you know, Tuesday night. Sometimes it's better to do some writing and some research in advance. And last but not least, it's super, super important to begin with the audience in mind that you're trying to talk to, right? So if you have a main point, right, like the hate crimes task force that I mentioned earlier, you may want to talk to different groups of people in different ways about that, right? And how you do that, how you end up sharing your opinion and what outlet, what newspaper or what blog you decide to talk to, those are all related things, right? So, you know, if you're going to talk to business leaders, you might want to try writing for the Wall Street Journal, because we know that people who, you know, care a lot about business are reading the Wall Street Journal every day. If you were going to write to, say, teachers, you might want to focus in on a magazine that teachers read, like Education Week Teacher. If you're just trying to talk to everybody, to the average citizen, USA Today is a pretty good place to start, right? Because that's the most widely read paper, widely subscribed paper in the United States. You don't have to start out with your op-ed and say, I'm only going to pitch it to this one place. And if they don't take it, then, you know, I'm done and I'm not going to do anything else with it. That's not, I'm not trying to be overly limited in saying this. I think what I am trying to say is that the outlet that you pitch to, the audience that you're trying to speak to, and the way that you talk about your opinion are all interrelated. And the more you think about that in advance of writing and while you're writing, then the better your final product is going to be. I know I went through that last part a little bit quickly. So does anybody have questions so far other than like diving in on the different kinds of research? Because we're going to talk about that here in this section.
If you have any questions, just raise your hands or you can chat them. The raise the hand function should be at the bottom of your screen. Give everyone a minute, Graham. Okay, so there's one question. It says, it is hard to verify facts. How do we do that?
That's a really, really good question. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I have a slide later in here where I say, make sure to check your own facts. Yeah, I think that, you know, the best way to do that, if you're looking for a fact or a figure, I think I usually find very reliable sources are news, what we call the wire services for news. So like the AP or Reuters, those folks are usually like even more so than, you know, big papers like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, which, you know, maybe kind of have a different political slant to them. The wire sources are usually pretty cut and dry in terms of in terms of the facts that they're presenting. One thing that's always helpful to do when you're writing your draft is, you know, if you want to cite a statistic and you say, you know, 50% of hate crimes that have happened in my city have been, you know, targeted at religious minorities, right? You can link to, you can do an in-text hyperlink to the news, to the page on the website where you found that. So it's usually like if you highlight the text and insert a hyperlink that way, that's a way so the editor can look and see, oh, they got this from the AP or they got this from Reuters, as opposed to like, I don't know where this information came from. It is hard to verify facts though, especially in this day and age. There are good fact-checking websites that kind of do deep dives. Snopes is a really good one if you've heard of that. Factcheck.org, I believe, is another one, but always good to double check. Always good to double check.
And Graham, so just a follow-up to that question is sometimes we find incorrect sources. And so I think what the question is asking is, or what the comment is getting to, is that the challenge is that sometimes there are incorrect links that exist. Like there are sites that have incorrect information about a certain topic or a certain issue. And so how do you navigate ensuring that the editor understands that like there is maybe a difference of opinion, or there's a difference of facts, or there's been, you know, propaganda or whatever that may be?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think that this is part of the benefit of writing an op-ed, right? If you feel that there's misinformation about something that you care about or something that you know about, an op-ed is a great way to, you know, get the truth as you see it out there into the world. And so I think that, you know, as long as you are, you know, when you write a piece, if you go to an editor and they ask you, hey, you know, where did you check this fact? As long as you can direct them back to a source, then you're going to be in a good place. And that's a real benefit of writing op-eds, is to get your truth out there for people to see. I see I have the window here pulled up, so I see there's a couple other questions. With respect to choosing the right newspaper, you can get a great sense, honestly, just from reading the opinion pages of the paper you're thinking about writing for, or reading the you know, online submissions of the blog that you're thinking about writing for. But this is something that I'm really happy to help you with, right? The Sikh Coalition, we do a lot of programmatic work specifically in service of, you know, goals. We're an organization that's trying to end employment discrimination or create safer classrooms. But a big part of, like, if you reach out to me and say, hey, I really want to write about, you know, this issue, but I'm not sure what the outlet is, where to pitch it. I'm always happy to hop on the phone or send you an email back and say, well, for my money, I think it'd be good for you to, reach out to this paper or that online magazine. That's something I'm super happy to help with. But the best practice you can get aside from writing is just reading the opinion pages of where it is that you want to submit, because then you get a sense for the kinds of things that they cover, the tone of voice that they're comfortable with, right? Some outlets are very formal and fact oriented, and others are, you can be a little bit more casual, a little bit more fun in your language. So I hope that answers that question. With respect to a personal interview as a source, I think it really depends. More often than not, I think a personal interview falls more into the category of reporting. So like, a reporter would come out and interview someone and ask them questions and then publish a news story about that interview. I think the way to get around that, if you're writing an op-ed, might be, I want to share this person's story, just so long as there's an opinion that's driving it, right? So if you were trying to, I hate to keep coming back to the hate crimes thing, but that's where my head is right now. If you were trying to tell the story about why hate crime laws are important, and you did that by interviewing someone who experienced, bias or discrimination, that would be a really good way to do that. But in general, with op-eds, it's usually easiest to write from your own perspective. But I think every once in a while, with the right finessing, a personal interview and somebody else's experience can work. Okie dokie. I'm going to go ahead and keep going, and we'll pause for questions again at the end of this next session, if that's okay. But thank you for your thoughtful questions. I appreciate it. So how do you write an op-ed, right? There are lots of different ways to write an op-ed. What I'm going to give you here in the next couple of slides is, it's not a formula. It's not something that you have to follow 100%. It's a blueprint. It is definitely one way of doing things. And the more you write, the more you practice, you'll get comfortable with writing in different ways. So just keep that in mind, that over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about one way to do it, right? A blueprint. What is that blueprint? So it's an introduction where we lay out our main idea and our news hook. It's the 3 body paragraphs, right, where you provide evidence in support of your opinion to persuade your reader. And then it's the conclusion, where you kind of summarize everything you already said and wrap it up in a nice, neat little bow. Again, if you open the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, you will notice that not every op-ed is 5 paragraphs with an introduction and a conclusion and 3 in the middle. This is just one way to do it. And I encourage you to, as you get more comfortable writing, and as you're thinking about doing things, like, definitely feel free to branch out beyond just this blueprint. But we're going to start with it for now. So for the next couple slides, I'm going to walk you through these different pieces, and I'm going to use bits of an op-ed that I wrote specifically for this training, right? And the main idea of this op-ed, something I hope that we can all get on board with, is it is very important for every American to go vote in our national elections this November. Sikh Coalition just launched our Get Out the Vote efforts earlier this month. We have a tool for folks to check voter registration for free, and it's something we're going to be really excited about here for the next couple months in the lead up to November. So we're going to pretend that this is the op-ed that I'm writing to pitch, and that way we'll be able to keep coming back to the same common theme. So for the introduction, the good news is we've already talked about exactly how to do this, right? The introduction needs the news hook, the thing that makes the op-ed timely, and it needs your opinion or your thesis statement, like the main idea that you want folks to walk away with. And so, I went ahead and color coded this here. There we go. So you can see the news hook in green. Next week, the Democratic Party will convene. The Republicans will do the same. And then the bit in purple down there at the bottom, that's the main idea, right? Every American has a responsibility to check their voter registration and make their voice heard this November. There's a little bit of fluff there in the middle, right? A little bit of extra language just to kind of make things flow together and sound nice. But the thing about a good introduction is that if somebody walked away after reading this paragraph, right? I want them to read the whole op-ed. I want them to scroll down to the bottom of the webpage and leave me a nice comment, and then they go on about their day. But if they only read this introduction, they would know everything that I wanted to tell them right off the bat, right? You got to go vote. Here's why it's important to do it right now. Very simple, very concise, all squished into one paragraph. So that's what an introduction looks like. Body paragraphs, you have a lot more freedom. There's a lot you can do with the body paragraph. Like I said, it includes points and evidence that support your main opinion. You're backing up what you're telling people to do. So in my case, it would be like explaining why voting is important or why it's important to remind people to go and vote. Lots of different types of evidence that you can use: facts and figures, you can use quotes, and you can use your own personal experience. So, you know, by way of example, here's a body paragraph that I might put underneath the introduction that I just showed you, right? So voting is our civic duty and an important responsibility that we all share as members of a democracy. Right there in green, that's the point that supports my thesis statement. That's the thing that supports the reason why it's important for people to go and vote. And then everything else in purple is all the evidence that I have to back those points up, right? So, you know, unfortunately, voter turnout in the United States lags behind other countries. In 2016, only 56% of those eligible to vote in our country did so, compared to 73% in Finland, 77% in South Korea, and 79% in Australia. As our third president, Thomas Jefferson, once said, "We do not have government by the majority, we have government by the majority who participate." So whether it's facts and figures, whether it's quotes, whether it's anything else, there's evidence here that backs up the point that I'm trying to make. You have to think really carefully about the kinds of events that you include when you're writing an op-ed, right? Because everything that you do should be geared to be appealing to and to connect with your reader. Sometimes what's appealing to you might be a little bit different than what's appealing to your reader, especially if you're trying to persuade somebody, trying to bring them along to your point of view. With facts and figures, you know, I think the biggest thing with numbers, percentages are really nice and easy to understand because you know, like, oh, 59% of people who could have voted in our country. That's a really easy concept. But if you're talking about like money or time or really big numbers that are hard for people to wrap their heads around, it's always important to put things in context, right? You talk about like the difference between $1 million and $1 billion. If you're talking about, you know, this policy is going to cost $1 million to implement versus this policy is going to cost $1 billion to implement. 1 million seconds is about like 11.5 days. And 1 billion seconds is like 30 some years, right? There's a huge difference there, and we're not used to thinking about those kinds of numbers. So one thing that I do to, you know, help be persuasive is talking about things in terms that folks can really easily understand, right? If I say, you know, this bond issue in my local election is enough money to build 8 middle schools or 1 football stadium, right? That's like a really clear thing that people can compare in their heads. As we talked about earlier, fact checking is super important, right? Making sure that every claim that you make has a source, has a website that you can point back to. You don't have to do it like you would, you know, a research paper in school where you have to do fancy footnotes and citations or anything like that. But you do need to be able to provide evidence of the claims that you're making. Nothing's going to make an editor want to publish your work less than if you just put a bunch of, you know, unsubstantiated claims into a piece and don't provide any way to back it up. Quotes from validators. I think providing quotes in support of your argument is really helpful, right? Especially when it's famous people or people who are well regarded. You do have to think carefully about the person that you're quoting and how your audience thinks about them, right? So in that previous slide, you know, I was writing that little bit of text, and I was like, oh, like I found this quote from President Obama, who I really like. And I thought, oh, I'll put the President Obama quote in there. But then, you know, I got to thinking, I was like, man, there may be some folks on this presentation who think that President Obama was a really good president. There may be some people who, you know, don't like him as much. So maybe I'll go further back in history. Maybe I'll pick a founding father and have a quote. And of course, Thomas Jefferson too, right? I mean, there are definitely big problems with him in terms of, you know, being somebody who thinks about representative democracy. So always thinking about what's going to be appealing to your audience, I think is super, super important. And last but not least, personal experience, right? This idea that you can share your own personal perspective when you're talking in an op-ed. You know, I wrote a couple of examples and I feel like none of them really captured sort of holistically what I was trying to demonstrate, right? I could write about the first time that I went to vote when I was a kid. I could write about the first time that I visited the Capitol and talked to my elected representatives. I could tell a story about my grandpa who ran for, you know, Congress out in Kansas when I was just a little baby, right? There are a lot of different ways that I could make a point about going to vote based on things that I experienced. And some of that would be relatable to my audience and some of it wouldn't. But I think the main thing with telling a story is it's okay to use a personal story as evidence to back up your opinion, so long as you're thinking like, how is this going to be relatable to my audience? How are they going to look at this story and say, oh, I remember the first time that I went to vote, or I remember the first time that I talked to my representatives, or I remember, the family member who got me interested in caring about government or the world around me. So all food for thought, lots of different types of research that you can put into your op-eds. And I think we'll probably come back to this in the questions here in a second. So I'm going to keep going if that's okay. One little trick that I want to share with you, and this is kind of outside of like the blueprint that I laid out, a really simple structure. It's a little trick that my very first boss in communications taught me, and she called it the to be sure. And it's a sneaky little way of propping up your argument by pretending to tear it down a little bit. So in this paragraph, right, we say, to be sure, voting takes time and effort. You need to check your registration well in advance, and no one likes to stand in long lines, even on election day. Plus, the added uncertainty of the pandemic, right, of coronavirus, can make the idea of going to your polling place unappealing. So that green part right there, that's the to be sure. That's where I said, hey, I get it. If you're not convinced that you need to go vote, there are a lot of good reasons why you might be worried about doing that. But here's the kicker, right? Everything that comes after it. However, this is all the more reason to learn about the laws that allow time off from work to vote, or even ask how you can vote by mail in your state. With just a little advanced preparation, you can still fulfill your civic duty this November. So we set up an argument against the opinion we're trying to prove, and then we knock it down right away, right? And it's kind of a little rhetorical trick. It's you never want to be arguing against your own point too much. It's really important to come right back and say, but here's how this is overcome, or here's how this opinion still holds up in the face of this criticism. But it's just something to think about in terms of, imagine your reader and think, man, what's the biggest objection to my opinion? Like, what is the one thing that if I want my reader to walk away and say, I'm definitely going to vote this November, that they might say, well, I'm worried about getting sick, or I don't want to take time off from work, and then show them how that's not the case. Show them how they can still vote anyway. Last but not least, and I think the conclusion is probably the easiest bit of all, because you're really just restating your thesis and tying everything together, right? At the end of the day, your introduction and your conclusion are kind of like bookends, and the rest of your argument is in the middle. So if your intro and your conclusion sound pretty similar and say some of the same things, that's a good thing. I had a grade school teacher who, when she taught us how to write 5-paragraph essays, she said, you tell them what you're going to tell them, you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them, right? And that is kind of what I'm saying you should do, right? Lay out your opinion, give all the evidence to back it up, and then restate your opinion there at the end. So very simple. This November, everyone has a reason to vote. Maybe the same issues have motivated you before, like taxes or healthcare. Perhaps new problems are weighing on your mind, from COVID to climate change. No matter what it is, though, we're all affected by the outcome of the elections, not just in terms of who occupies the White House, but the state and local level office holders who shape our states, cities, and communities too. That's why I'll be voting, and I hope millions of other Americans can make the responsible choice to do the same. There's some fluff there, right? There's some extra language, but the core of that paragraph is just, I hope millions of other Americans will join me and make the responsible choice to vote. Super simple. Again, this is just a blueprint. It's just one way to go about doing this. I encourage you to write and try different things, make your arguments in different ways. Maybe you just want to focus on one piece of evidence and really dive deep into it. Maybe you want to give an overwhelming number of facts and figures and opinions to back up your thesis statement. There are lots of different ways to do this, but hopefully that 5-paragraph structure is a good way to get you started if you've never written an op-ed before. So I want to stop here. I'm going to open my little chat box for this. Yes, so Sajit mentioned we will be sharing a recording of the session, so you can make sure that you can see the slides and see all the different things that I've written here, if that's helpful. Is talking about a personal memory or an experience necessary for an op-ed? That's a really good question. I think it's something that you can do. I don't think it's something that you have to do. There are a lot of people, especially, what I like to call professional opinion havers, right? People who are columnists, who write for newspapers, who write about a whole range of issues that they don't have any personal experience in. You definitely don't have to have a personal story to share. I think it helps. I think it helps you connect with your audience. I think it helps to put some emotion into the argument that you're trying to make, but I don't think that it's required. And I think we had a raised hand also.
Yeah, I'm gonna unmute them right now.
Okay.
Rajveer,
Yes.
did you have a question?
Yeah. Look, my question is, you know in the slideshow, you know when the paragraphs turn, part of it turn green, part of it turns purple, what do the colors mean?
Oh, so I color coded so you could see when it was the let's see, when it was the main opinion, and then when it was the evidence that was backing it up. So I just color coded to help you see the different parts of the paragraph. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I think when you see the recording and you can pause and look at the slides, it'll be a little clearer. So I'm sorry if I went too fast.
That's okay. No problem.
And then another question from Anil: what can you do if you don't have a personal experience? How can you elevate your arguments? I think, that's where all these other kinds of research comes in, where you use other people's quotes, or you use facts and figures, research from a news organization or a think tank or government. There are lots of other ways to back up your arguments rooted in objective fact rather than your own experience. You definitely don't have to have a personal experience. I think it just helps to help folks relate to it a little bit, if that makes sense.
And Anil, I saw that you had your hand raised. Did you have a follow-up question to that? I'm gonna unmute you real quick.
No, it was just to ask that question.
Perfect. And so then we had another question from Radhika. If you're conducting interviews to get those quotes, it strengthens your work. I think yes. I think that if you do enough interviews, you have something that ends up looking more like a piece of journalism and less like an opinion article. And so you could go to newspapers, accept people who are freelance journalists who aren't necessarily employed by the paper or by the blog. So it just kind of depends on how much interviewing you're doing, if that makes sense. So Harleen had a really good question. How do you reach out to a media outlet to understand requirements or length? And I'm glad that you asked that, because that's just about what I'm going to focus on right now. So I think I'm going to pause questions for now and get through this last section, and then we'll talk about that. So how do you pitch an op-ed, right? You have this great piece, you've put your research into it, you have your core opinion, you've got maybe a personal story in there, maybe not, maybe you've got an interview that you did with somebody else. How do you pitch that? How do you present it to a newspaper or a blog and say, hey, I think you should publish this in your paper or on your website? So as much as what I just gave you was a blueprint, right, a suggestion for how to write an op-ed, pitching is the opposite. It's really formulaic. It's always the same, and it's really easy. It's really easy to do over and over again. So I'm going to walk you through the steps. The first thing, as Harleen mentioned, right, you have to know the rules. You have to know how many words you can use, and anything else. The easiest way to do that is just to go to the internet and go into Google and look for submission guidelines for whatever outlet you're trying to write for. So for me, I just did it for the Washington Post, and this is what comes up. Like, the Post wants less than 750 words, and it needs to be exclusive to us, and it can't be anonymous. Like, they lay out all the rules. Most papers and most online outlets do this. If you can't find like how to submit, if they don't say email this person, it's usually a good idea to look up the opinion editor or the editorial page editor, especially for smaller papers. Those are the folks who are going to be reading your op-ed and determining whether or not they're going to publish it. So that's typically how you find out. The other thing you can do is always just go and look on the opinion pages of the outlet that you're looking at. I've had to do that before, where they didn't have guidelines about how many words. So I just kind of did a word count of the past 5 or so pieces, averaged it out, and see about how long each of the pieces are. So that's just a little primer on submission guidelines, and happy to share more about that if folks have specific questions. So what does a pitch look like, right? What is that email where you say, hey, will you publish my work? What does that actually look like? They're super short and super formulaic. but they always have to be specific to the editor that you're pitching. To pitch an op-ed, you just have to answer 3 questions, one after another, right? Why me? Like, why am I the person who's writing this piece? Why this? Like, what is the topic? And why now? Why is it relevant to publish this today versus all the other op-eds that that editor might be considering? So why me is the easiest, right? Explain why you're the best author to write on this subject. So if I'm writing a piece about voting, right, I would say that I work for a civil rights organization. We're a civil rights organization. We care about voting. We want people to vote. That's pretty intuitive. Sometimes if you are writing, especially for a local paper or for a blog that's like active in your area, sometimes it's as simple as just saying like, I'm one of your readers. Like, my name is Graham West and I'm a longtime resident of Silver Spring, Maryland, or like, I'm a longtime reader of your blog. Sometimes the reason that you're the good op-ed author is because you've been reading this publication and you care, right? So always open with who you are and why it matters that you're writing. Second question, why this, right? What is the op-ed about? This is just that coming back to that thesis statement, that opinion that you want people to walk away with. So in my case, I'm writing to encourage members of my community to get out and vote in our elections this fall. Super straightforward, super simple. Sometimes if you're writing a more complicated piece, you have to take a couple of sentences to do this, but the shorter and simpler it is, the more likely an editor is to say, okay, I understand what this piece is about, and I'm going to look at it and consider publishing it. And then why now? Explain why your op-ed is timely. Share that news hook that you've got in the beginning of the piece, right? So in my case, I might say something like, with voter registration deadlines looming in our community, in our county, I want to make sure that everyone knows how to get registered as soon as possible, right? So, saying that like, it's really important that we all know how to do this now, because as of next week, you won't be able to register to vote anymore. I'm making that up, but you see, like you put a little bit of the urgency in there by helping the editor understand what it is about your op-ed that's newsy or relevant or likely to excite people to read. When you put this all together, you have to add 2 more final things, right? Exclusivity and a deadline. So exclusivity is this idea that editors only want to publish things that haven't been published anywhere else. It's really tempting, I think, especially when you put a lot of time and effort into an op-ed, to write something and then send it to, the top 10 newspapers that you'd love to publish it in. And it seems like a good idea, except then you run into a big problem if 2 editors both say that they want to use your piece. Then it's really awkward because you have to take it away from one of them and they get mad and they don't want to publish anything by you in the future. So always say, I'm submitting this piece exclusively to wherever, right? In my case, it might be the Northern Virginia Daily, but maybe it's, the Boston, the Boston Globe or the Chicago Tribune or whatever the case may be. And then you also add a deadline, right? The deadline is just to encourage the editor to respond to you in a particular amount of time about your piece. Because if you just send it to them and they never say anything, then you don't know if you can move on to pitching to a new outlet, and it puts you in a bad position. Editors aren't in any way obligated to get back to you, right? In my example here, I say, hey, please let me know by Wednesday, COB, close of business. So, 5:00 p.m. on Wednesday. Editor who reads this isn't under any obligation to get back to me by Wednesday at 5 p.m. But if they don't, and then I move on to a new paper the next day, and they come back to me on Friday afternoon and say, hey, can we publish your piece? Then it's within my rights to say, oh, well, I put a deadline there and I didn't hear back from you, so I went ahead and moved on with the piece. It's just kind of part of the, I guess, the professional etiquette, if you will, of like how we do this is like, give them a chance to consider it. They'll listen to the deadline, respond to you if they're interested or not. One thing that I think is super helpful is always doing some follow-up, right? So making sure that you give them one more chance to look at the op-ed. A reasonable deadline is usually 24 to 48 hours, depending on how timely your news hook is, how many other people might be writing about the event. It's really easy to follow up. You just click forward on your original email and just nice, pleasantly persistent, like, hey, I just wanted to make sure you saw the below piece, wanted to put it at the top of your inbox. Please let me know if you've had a chance to consider it. Sometimes you'll get a reply back that says, yes, we'd love to look in your piece, and that's the end of it, easy peasy. Sometimes they will come back and say, hey, we're interested in this piece, but wondering if you will review these edits, or if you can tell us a little bit more about this or a little bit less of that. I would really encourage you, if you ever do get that opportunity to work with an editor directly on a piece, to take them up on it 100%. These are folks who, you know, are trained in how to write opinion pieces. They know what their readers like. They know what persuasive writing sounds like. Edits are always yours to take or leave, right? At the end of the day, you're the boss. If you don't want them to say something, you say, nope, sorry, I'm not comfortable with those edits. I'm not going to publish. But 9 times out of 10, it's good and constructive to work with them to refine the piece in a way that they think it'll get the most traction, the most attention. So I just want to go back one slide here if I can do that. Yes. So this is the entirety of the pitch right here. Like this is the email. Why me? Why this? Why now? Exclusivity and a deadline. 5 things, super formulaic, all in a row. Very simple. Last but not least, and this gets a whole slide to itself because it's super important, no attaching files, right? So if you submit your op-ed, you copy and paste the text from the Word document or Notepad or wherever you've been working on it, and you paste it in the email. When you attach a file, a lot of times that gets caught in people's spam filters, right? They think somebody's trying to send them a virus or an advertisement or whatever, and so they don't see the piece. And that's the worst thing in the world, right? You put in time and then the editor doesn't even get to see what it is that you're trying to send them. So if you remember anything from this presentation, definitely that all op-eds have to have opinions in them. But then probably the second thing is no attachments. Always make sure that you copy and paste the body of the op-ed into the text of the email. Okie dokie. I have a summary slide just to go through kind of like the most important points after this, but I want to pause and see if there's any questions on pitching specifically, because I know that this is kind of like the, what do you say, back of the house, kind of like the inside scoop that folks may not be familiar with. So I want to pause and see if we have any questions on that. Let's see here. So there's a couple questions from a while back. So I'm going to go ahead and answer these in order. Let's see here. Can we expect to be contacted to verify we wrote the op-ed before it is published? How do we know it is someone with the paper or website that is contacting us to do verification? That's a really, really good question. And I think that goes pretty close to one of the questions on down is most of the conversation via email. Do you have a phone conversation with editors? So usually when somebody writes you back, they'll usually send you an email rather than a phone call. For whatever reason, most op-ed folks that I have worked with really prefer to correspond over email rather than talking on the phone. A good way to make sure that they are who they say they are is to look at their, the part of their email address that's after the @ sign, right? So for me, it's graham@sikhcoalition.org, like making sure it's like @washingtonpost.com or @New York Times or whatever the outlet is. That's probably the best way to verify. What could you study in university to further your understanding on writing op-eds? That's a really good question. I think probably communications is the best like college major to study. If it makes you feel better, I was not a communications major. I studied foreign policy and a bunch of other things, and now I do communications for a living. I think anything that gets you practice writing is going to make you a better op-ed writer. Writing a term paper for college or high school and writing an op-ed for a newspaper are totally different types of writing, for sure. But anything that gives you a better command of language and a better bit of practice in terms of making an argument is super helpful in the long run. So I'd say communications is probably the best thing, but anything where you're writing is helpful. What does ASAP stand for? As soon as possible. Sorry, sometimes I tend to abbreviate things. And just to circle back, exclusivity one more time, somebody asked what exactly does that mean? So that just means if I go to the paper and I say, hey, I'm sharing this just with you. You're the only paper that I'm offering this piece to. And so if you run my op-ed piece, you know that no other paper anywhere else in the country is going to have this argument. And let's see here, back to slide 44. Yeah, these are the guidelines for following up. So somebody has to see this slide again. Okay. And oh, here's a good one. Do newspaper publications accept op-eds from people of any age, or do they tend to accept pitches from certain ages? I think in general, it's less about your age and more about your experience on the topic, right? So if you are, on the younger side, maybe a college student, high school student, middle school student, even, if you know what you're talking about and you make it clear to the editor through the piece that you write that you know what you're talking about, that shouldn't be a barrier for you to getting published. I think, adults probably have an easier time of it than kids do in general. But a lot of times being a younger person, especially being a kid, lends you a perspective on issues that is worthy of consideration and that is not often found in everyday reporting on a topic, if that's helpful. Definitely don't be afraid to write just because you're on the younger side, is what I would say. Two good questions. Hey, Sunny, how you doing? Two good questions about co-authoring. Is there a recommended cap on the number of authors? I would generally say 2 authors on a piece. Like if you're sharing the responsibility, 2 authors is the most you can do. I have published an op-ed by 3 authors before, which was super easy, fortunately for me, because they were all on the same page and really easy to work with. But writing by committee is really, really a tough thing to do. And I think most papers will kind of bulk if you have more than 2 authors on something. We worked with another organization a couple months ago now. They had originally written an open letter that like 50 people had signed on to, and they asked like, hey, can we, get this published as an op-ed? And so kind of help them rework it to be less of a letter and more of an op-ed, make it flow a little bit better. And we had them cut it down to just 2 authors, and that piece was able to get published. So I would say in general, try to split your authoring with only 1 other person. Let's see here. Oh, how much would you say is the average word count for digital magazines or websites? I would say, hard to say off the top of my head, but I would say, for a newspaper, you're looking at like 500 to 700 words. And for a digital outlet, you could be looking at like 600 to 900. And again, it totally depends on those submission guidelines. And you can look those up by Googling. You can reach out to the editors and ask the question, or you can just look on the pages and see how long other people's pieces are. Okay, I think I got through all of the questions.
Graham, we just got 2 more.
Yep, I see that. Okay, let's see. Slide 46. Yes, so slide 46 is just a reminder not to attach any files. So you can copy and paste the text from your op-ed into the email directly, but don't drag and drop the Word document on there, because that's where we get caught in spam filters and editors don't see your good work. Really good question. So in op-eds that are published in like the Washington Post, there are pictures included in the op-ed. I wanted to share some pictures from a project I'm working on for an op-ed, but wasn't sure if as the writer submit the pictures, or does the publisher choose them? More often than not, the publisher or the editor that you're working with is going to choose not just the picture that goes with the piece, but the headline also. So unfortunately, I've had a lot of people reach out and say, hey, why is this headline on the piece that you published? And it's like, it was out of my hands. Like the editors decide what they think is the most compelling headline. And very, very rarely do you reach back out to them and say, hey, I think this is really misleading or really not a good way to characterize my argument. Most of the time, editors and publishers retain the discretion to do that. I think for, if it's a project that you're working on, say maybe you want to write about a SAVA project that you've been involved with, if you send a picture for something like that, they may be interested in publishing it alongside, they may not. It kind of just depends on the paper. But I think overall, especially when you see like op-eds in the Washington Post, those are usually pictures that the editors and the publishers have picked out rather than the authors. Never hurts to ask, right? The answer is always say no. The answer is always no unless you ask, but just sort of set your expectation. And you'll just ask, do we send in a headline with our piece? I think you can. you definitely can, but there's no guarantee that they're going to use your headline. You get to be in charge of what words are in the op-ed. That's totally up to you. The headline, the pictures, that stuff is totally up to them. One other question, what kind of outlets do you recommend for writers who are just starting out? Starting locally, yeah, is the best approach. You have automatic credibility right away because like your expertise, right, your reason for sharing your story is because you're writing for your hometown paper. They're usually have fewer submissions coming in, so they can be a little bit more thoughtful, take a little bit more time to work with you on your pieces. So I would definitely recommend writing writing for a local paper, starting locally first and foremost. Okie dokie. No attachments. So I'm just going to go through here this last summary slide because we're, I think, close to time. Just a couple points I want to leave you with, if nothing else, right? Before you start writing, at the very beginning of all this, make sure you have your opinion, your news hook, your bits of research, and your audience in mind, right? If you start out with those 4 things, you're going to have everything you need moving forward. Use lots of different kinds of opinions, or at least lots of different kinds, of evidence to support your opinion, right? So don't feel like you have to just tell personal stories. Don't feel like you just have to hit people with facts and figures. Use a combination of different things to help people understand why your opinion is important, why they should feel some way and walk away and act some way that they weren't before. Similar to that, make sure everything that you write is written in the best way to connect with your audience, right? So just remember that sometimes the things that are really compelling to you, things that are easy to understand, things that you know automatically, may not be the same for your audience. So always try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and think, what's compelling to them? What's going to persuade them? What do I need to help them understand in order to see my point of view? Once you get done with writing your piece, follow that pitching formula. Why me? Why this? Why now? Every time. It's very simple. It's very clear. It's exactly what the editor needs to know in order to determine if they want to publish your piece or not. And then the last piece here is probably the most important of anything that I've said, other than the fact that op-eds always have an opinion and the fact that we shouldn't have attachments, right? The third big thing, don't get discouraged if you don't get placed on your first try, especially if it's your first time writing an op-ed at all, especially if you're on the younger side and you're trying to do this for the first time. I can't tell you, I've been doing this for more than 6 years now. Part of my job has been writing op-eds. I've gotten so many rejection letters from so many different newspapers and online blogs. And it's just part of the way that it goes. Editors are always considering, not just the merits of your piece, whether it's good or not, but they're thinking about all the other submissions they have. They're thinking about what their bosses told them to focus on. They're thinking about what the reporters are doing and how to make their pieces relevant to the leading stories. They're considering so many other factors that you never have to be ashamed or discouraged if they say, hey, thanks, but we're going to pass on this. It's a totally normal thing. It happens all the time. It happens to people whose job it is to write op-eds all the time. So if nothing else, don't get discouraged after that first rejection. Keep writing, keep practicing, keep going for local papers or even school papers, anywhere you can get your foot in the door. And the more you practice, the better you'll get, the more comfortable you'll get with putting your opinion out there. And that's kind of the most important thing as far as I'm concerned. So I'm going to pop open my chat box here. Oh, how do you come up with ideas for op-eds? So me specifically, that's a really good question. I think part of the job of working in communications, especially for an organization like the Sikh Coalition, is to look at the news and kind of say, how can we use what's going on in public right now to talk about the issues that we care about, right? And sometimes that leads to us, writing about sad things like hate crimes or employment discrimination or racism from different people in society. Other times it leads to really positive stories of like, here was a court case that got decided in a really just way, or here's a community that is, here's a local community that's given back to the people in need around them because of the coronavirus. So, that's my thought process, is sort of look at what everybody's talking about and say, how can I insert the people who I care about, the people who I represent? How can I get them into this conversation and get them a piece of the pie, if you will? Really good question from Persimmon. If you're rejected, is it appropriate to ask for feedback as well as asking why? It's definitely appropriate. I think it's a lot like putting a deadline on the piece. Like some editors will take the time to say why, others won't, whether because they don't feel like they have to, which is kind of rude, or because they just don't have the time to do it. But it's always appropriate to ask. I think as long as you make it clear that you just want to improve for future reference, then most people are going to be inclined to be nicer about that, even if they can't take the time to write out a really sort of detailed response. If you write and you get rejected, if nothing else, that person has seen your name in their inbox before, right? And so they're going to recognize you versus the next person who writes an op-ed for the very first time. So there's cause for cautious optimism there, even if you're rejected. And if the editor takes the time to say, hey, sorry, we're just really full up on submissions right now, we can't publish this, that's still pretty good in the sense that you got a chance to get your opinion out there and you can move on to the next place and try and pitch it. Okay, I think we're pretty close to time. Just another kind of question about, what do we have to do to get ideas for op-eds? I think it's just about what you have opinions about. That's the most important thing. It's the intersection of what you have an opinion about and, what's timely, what's newsy. There are a lot of things that I care about that I would love to write opinion pieces about that aren't really related to anything in the news, right? So when I want to do that, I have to think really creatively about how to carve out the space to write an op-ed and to get an editor interested in my opinion. But as long as it's something that you are passionate about and something that you think an editor is going to care about because of something that's going on in the news or coming up on the calendar, that's kind of your best bet. Okie dokie. I think that's everybody. I will, my email is there at the bottom of the screen, media@sikhcoalition.org. That goes to me and my teammate both. So if you have any questions, I know, Sajid, we're gonna post the presentation online so folks can see it, can see the slide deck. So if you missed anything, but if you just want to say hi, if you're interested in writing op-eds, give me a shout. Always happy to work directly with community members. That's the best part of the job for sure. So I hope to hear from all of you. I hope to see all of you putting yourselves out there. This country has no shortage of people with opinions, and you might as well be one of them at the end of the day, right? You've got valid perspective to share, and so I encourage everybody to do that. And I think that is it for me.
Thank you, everyone. We have an exit poll as you're heading out, just to tell us how the session was. And Graham, thank you. That was a fantastic session.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share if that's okay, Sajid.
Yes, excellent. All right, have a great day, everyone, and hope you'll take a second to just vote as you exit.
Thank you all so much.